Good day, everyone, and welcome to the 7th USRN University Social Responsibility Network Forum. Good morning, good evening, good day, good afternoon, buongiorno, bom dia, buenos dias. I hope we never run out of ideas the way that I'm running out of languages right now. But I hope that everyone is having a wonderful day and is ready for an exchange and a discussion in all the talks that we will have today. This meeting will be recorded and will be made available on the USRN website. And with our speakers' consent, the slides will also be made available. Today, in the 7th of the USRN online forum series, we will have three speakers who will talk about science skepticism, distrust and expertise, and forms of denialism that have sprouted and grown in recent years. We have been beset by post-truth dynamics and challenged on the science and social sciences front, as well on the trust and politics front. Ideology and politics are waved as banners by those who want to change the world or perhaps just change minds or challenge reality. But as White might warn us, abandoning the notion of any kind of objective truth also takes away the possibility of rallying for causes such as social justice, human rights. This online forum will bring together three speakers from USRN member institutions to explore the challenges that we face and to consider pressing questions such as what responsibilities do scientists carry within the framework of university social responsibility? How should science communication respond in an age of mistrust and misinformation? And what are the implications for teaching and learning? What and how should we be teaching our students? When we are done with our three speakers, we will have a discussion. Thanks to everyone for sending your questions ahead of time. We will tackle all of these in the forum and in the discussion, and we will open the floor for questions. Everyone, I once again wish you a good day, and you can and are free to share on the chat not just your questions and your comments, but where you are in the world as well. We will begin with our very first speaker, a professor of epistemology and metaphysics and part of the Faculty of Social Sciences and Humanities at the Vrije Universiteit, Amsterdam, Professor Jeroen de Ridder. Dr. de Ridder, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Inez. And thanks for having me, and welcome everyone from the Netherlands as well. Let me quickly share my slides, and then I'll dive right in. Give me a sec. All right, there they are. Okay, so what I want to try to do in these 8 to 10 minutes is maybe put concerns about post-truth, misinformation, disinformation into a bit of perspective. And of necessity, I'll have to be brief, and I'm sure what I will say will raise many questions, and I hope to be able to answer some of them at least after the three talks. Okay, so it shouldn't be a surprise to any of you that there has been a lot of talk about post-truth, about disinformation, about the influence that's having on people's beliefs and actions. And I'll just give you a few quick examples. Here's Barack Obama talking about an epistemological crisis that we're entering into. And this is one of my favorite quotes because I think Obama might be one of the few, if not the only world leader who has ever used the word epistemology. So I'm super excited about that. Here's Marcia McNutt, president of the American Academy of Sciences, claiming that misinformation is worse than an epidemic. And this was during the COVID pandemic or soon after. So clearly people are concerned about mis and disinformation and the effects that it's having. So let's think about that a bit deeper. And what I would like to do is present three brief myths, or at least what I believe to be myths, about disinformation, misinformation, and our post-truth conundrum. And here's the first one, and I think it's a particularly important one that is far too easily ignored. So in the background of I think, policy making, but also in the background of the broader cultural discussion, public discourse about mis and disinformation, is the assumption that we can easily or relatively easily identify mis and disinformation in order to then fight it, combat it, develop policies against it. But I think this is far more difficult than people tend to realize. And I think, given that all of you work in research institutions of some kind or have done so, this shouldn't be a complete surprise to you. Because, I mean, we're all perfectly aware as researchers that it can be quite difficult to figure out what's true and false, especially when it comes to big complicated issues having to do with the frontiers of knowledge, having to do with policy development, having to do with big societal problems and challenges, and how they can best be addressed. Figuring out what's true and false is far from easy. So here are some common definitions of mis and disinformation. Misinformation is typically characterized as false or misleading information, whereas disinformation is distinguished from it by its intentionality. So disinformation is intentionally false or misleading information. So these are lovely definitions on paper, but using those definitions to then pinpoint real-world examples of mis and disinformation is hard because it is so difficult to figure out what's true and false on the one hand, and also what is misleading or not misleading. And so apart from the point about truth and falsity, let me also make a brief comment about how we identify what's misleading. I mean, what is misleading is often influenced by our broader background assumptions, sometimes by values that we embrace, political views that we hold. And what counts as misleading to one person may not be misleading to another person. And this is certainly not to say that anything goes and the truth is relative and everyone can have their own version of reality and the facts. But again, when it comes to big, complicated issues in research, in society, saying what's misleading and what's not misleading is really hard to do. And to give you just sort of one example, and I apologize for all the US-centric examples here, but I figured they might be sort of easily recognizable to many of you. I mean, just depending on what newspaper you read or what television programs you watch, you might end up with very different estimations or very different senses of what is and is not misleading. And again, this is not to say that all of this is equally valid, but saying what is and is not misleading is really difficult. All right, quickly on to the second myth then. There is this concern in public discourse that there is more and more disinformation, a big wave of disinformation, conspiracy theories, propaganda, you name it, and that the influence of misinformation is enormous and growing. When we look at actual research in communication science, in political science, in psychology, this is just not supported by the evidence. This myth that's been with us for at least 10 years now, I think. So here are some sobering statistics that I want to present you with. And again, this might raise a lot of questions, but I mean, the first thing to realize when it comes to mis and disinformation, people typically look to the internet and social media in particular. But most of the time that people spend on the internet is not time in which they're trying to inform themselves or read the news. Most of what people are doing on the internet is entertainment. They're watching TV shows, they're watching YouTube, they're connecting with their friends and families. Informing yourself or reading the news is really just a small sliver of time and traffic on the internet. So, I mean, that's the first thing to sort of put into perspective. There's been a lot of research on social media and misinformation there, but really that's just a tiny sliver of the information that people consume. And here are some more statistics, and these percentages are sort of they average the results from a number of studies. It turns out that both the supply and the consumption of misinformation is very heavily skewed. So roughly 90% of the supply of mis and disinformation comes from between 0 and 5% of the accounts on social media. So it's not as if everyone is sharing and distributing misinformation and disinformation on the internet. On the consumption side, you get similarly skewed picture. So 80 to 90% of all disinformation is only seen or consumed, if you will, by 5% of the accounts on social media. And again, I mean, there are a huge number of people on social media. So even these low percentages in absolute numbers, it's significant. It's not nothing. But again, it sort of moderates this concern that disinformation is everywhere and that we're drowning in it. Really, it's sort of a heavily skewed business. I mean, putting it perhaps a bit too simplistic, but misinformation production and consumption is sort of a hobby of a small share of the people on social media. Then you might wonder, well, okay, so these are facts about the distribution and consumption, but what does it do? What does misinformation actually do? Well, again, if we look at the evidence, the studies from communication science, political science, psychology, it turns out that misinformation does relatively few things. So the effects it has on people's beliefs and their actions are very small, relatively small, and mostly short-lived. So it's not as if people see misinformation and suddenly change their beliefs and start acting in different ways from what they did before. So the effects of misinformation, again, tend to be relatively limited. All right, so that brings me to the third myth, which is the idea that people are easily influenced and convinced by disinformation. And again, that's just not what we find. And there is a wealth of evidence against this myth, really. And I'll show you the titles of just 3 books, and these are from psychology, neuroscience, from political science, and I mean there's much more. But so the general picture, and I'll try to summarize it as briefly as I can. The general picture that we get from people and how they form their beliefs and change their beliefs is really that people tend to be very conservative. They prefer to keep on believing what they always believed. And in many cases, they want to keep on believing what their parents or their friends believed. Because, I mean, that makes your life a lot more pleasant, right? If you are constantly disagreeing with all the people around you, you don't get invited to barbecues. It's not a great way to live your life. So people prefer to blend in when it comes to their beliefs, and they prefer to keep them the same. So in fact, it's kind of hard to get people to believe different things, let alone convince them to start acting in different ways to what they did before. Another thing, I mean, people have always been pretty badly misinformed about politics, for example, or about complex societal issues. So there's nothing new here. And, maybe it's not good news, but at least, I mean, it's the way it's always been. So what all this means, and that's where I'll wrap up, is, and I think there is a good case, but I'm happy if you want to disagree with me, there's a good case for thinking that disinformation is perhaps more of a symptom of what's going on in society than a cause of people acting in different ways. So sure, there are problems in society. There are people who don't trust institutions, who don't trust science, who don't trust each other, who don't trust their political opponents. But in the first place, I mean, this is nothing new. I mean, perhaps distrust in institutions and science has been on the rise, at least in some places. But the reason why is probably not mis and disinformation, but something else. Broader societal issues having to do with trust in each other, trust in institutions. And disinformation probably isn't a big part of the cause of that. It's more of a symptom of it. All right, I'll leave it here. And thanks so much for your attention. I look forward to the discussion, of course.
Thank you so much, Dr. De Ridder. Thank you for dispelling the myths and adding nuance to our discussion on the nature of misinformation and disinformation. And I do like your final thought on disinformation being the symptom and not the cause, which could allow us to discuss issues further, and which is always a good thing to have more questions. So allow me to piggyback on your ideas as I am the next speaker. I'll bring in once again epistemology and paradigms, especially for science and risk communication and the role of belief in decision making. So, once again, thank you, Dr. De Ridder. I am Dr. Inez Ponce de Leon of the Department of Communication of the Ateneo de Manila University, where I am an associate professor and where I specialize in science and risk communication. So when I was asked to give this talk, what immediately caught my eye was the idea of the automatic connection between trust and science and trust and fact, as well as the idea of an objective truth, which is good. Pope Leo XIV, in a recent statement, said that the search for and the need for an objective truth is what unites science and religion. And without this objective truth, we run into the trap of relativism, where human rights and social justice might no longer be addressed as well as they have been in the past. But allow me to provide an alternative view. This is a dated article, but I hope that it still sheds light on issues that are relevant today. This comes from Brian Wynn's, sadly, 1992 work on Chernobyl, the Chernobyl fallout and sheep farmers in the United Kingdom, particularly where sheep farmers and scientists had to interact and had to listen to science communication and had to fashion and refashion science communication in order to understand what the fallout meant for sheep farming. So this is a very localized study, but it also provides us with a glimpse into the nature of trust. So what Brian Wynn found was that people actually do trust scientists, not because of the facts that scientists have, but because they have no other choice, because they feel disempowered, because they feel they have no influence. And scientists do exert a great deal of influence in policy and governance in society. So this trust was more a form of resignation rather than something that was born out of knowledge. But there was also a dimension of distrust. This trust, not distrust, this trust was part of a much grander equation where people wanted their knowledge to be a part of the discussion because the scientists were giving information that was not socially relevant to sheep farmers, and the tips and not so many words that they were giving were difficult to do because the farmers and the scientists lived vastly different lives. In science communication, we call this the dissemination or the deficit model at work. And what should have been done was to talk to people about their knowledge of their situation and not to take for granted that trust is automatically associated with knowledge itself. So allow me to introduce you to my country, the Philippines. Yes, science mistrust is a great issue. It's not just for vaccines. We have been labeled the ground zero for election misinformation across the world, the very first place where misinformation was tested and found to really move elections. My specialization is in typhoon risk communication, and we found that people don't always heed their local governments when they're asked to evacuate. And we are a flood-prone, volcanic eruption-prone, name a disaster except for snow and tornadoes, and we have it. But also in the Philippines, we are not a broadcast country. We like discussions. In my research, I found that people don't follow evacuation orders immediately. They want to hear their local government come to their doors and knock, not because they want to be, the masters of the slaves that are in government, but they believe people who experience the same situations as they do. So they won't evacuate just because a scientist said so. They'll evacuate if a local leader who experiences the same hazard is telling them to leave, because we base our decisions on experience. So what I'm about to raise are a few questions that have to do with epistemology as well as science communication, though implicitly. And this is something that has appeared in the research literature, especially for climate change in the US, where people are bombarded with information, but climate change has become a partisan problem, a partisan issue. And in the end, what if people are defending their values and their link to information because they feel attacked for having values rather than being attacked for having the facts or not. Research has shown the information overload will just make people cling to their beliefs even more closely. And we see this happening in climate change, especially when you have models like reinforcing spirals, where people just keep on looking at for information to back up what they already know. Because it is, as Dr. De Ridder said, comforting. It gets you invited to barbecues. It doesn't get you shut out of the social sphere in which everyone wants to participate. But here's another question, and this is also along the lines of science communication. What if the way that science is taught in its standardized fashion of multiple choice and recipe-driven knowledge and laboratory work has turned it into a field that looks static rather than dynamic? And all of these outcomes and metrics are making non-scientists believe that knowledge is absolute. Yes, to objective truth, but that's very different from absolute knowledge. We know for a fact, and as a molecular biologist myself, and as a philosopher of science, we know that scientific processes are constant. It's the knowledge that might change or build upon itself. So what if it's that focus on results in the classroom and the breakthroughs in the media and the attention away from the processes of science? What if these have contributed to an image of science that is so distant, so that people are seeking trust in a science that doesn't exist? I'm offering these as possibilities because what if there really is trust? But we have to first ask, how do people fit information into their daily lives? Is there really politicization, and does it always trickle down? Notice that we might actually prioritize one concern, but people prioritize another, and we won't know unless we first ask them. Our view of objectivity is that of distance. But what if their experience is truly that, the objective assessment and appraisal of reality? For this, I'm borrowing Brian Wynn and standpoint theory by Harding and Wood, where we need to dive into reality to listen to how people articulate it, which means engagement across all sciences. And for this, I want to quote Wynn directly. The science communication framework isn't just accurate scientific knowledge, it's socially appropriate knowledge with assimilation of local knowledge and existing scientific knowledge. It's the indigenous indigenous and the objective. Communication then has to be part of all projects from the beginning. It's not just an ad hoc call in the communication expert at the end. It's more than dissemination, and we need to teach our students transdisciplinary and interdisciplinary knowledge where they have to engage with wicked problems and where they must respect all fields of study equally. And with that, I will end my presentation. And I thank you for your attention as well as your patience with my not so attractive slides. Thank you, everyone. We now move to our third presentation. Once again, please reserve your questions for later. Dr. Wenteng Yu is an assistant professor at Hong Kong Polytechnic University, where she teaches and does research at the Department of Language, Science, and Technology. Dr. Yu, you may begin.
Thank you, Professor Inez. Actually, I think your slides very attractive, and I like the discussion about objective knowledge. Hello everyone. My name is Jeroen Ting, and my friends call me Yui, so you can call me Yui as well. As Professor Inez mentioned, I now work as an assistant professor at the Department of Language, Science, and Technology at the Hong Kong Polytechnic University. So, greeting from Hong Kong. So, when I saw the film of this forum, it reminds me some of the interesting conclusions drawing from my research on misinformation and its solutions over the past 8 years, because I think the research about public perceptions of misinformation actually helped me to think about this topic. How can we better do science communication in the post-truth era? So in the past 8 years, my co-authors and I have done a lot of empirical studies about misinformation, including the patterns of misinformation exposure, misinformation sharing, how misinformation exposures affect people's beliefs and perceptions, also the following behaviors. We also work on the possible solutions, including professional fact checkings done by journalists or professional organizations, individual verification, and media literacy. Currently, I'm working on a government-funded project on how to increase media literacy among the elder adults in Hong Kong. So first of all, I would like to clarify that the misinformation I study in my empirical research can be defined as false information judged by the best of our current scientific knowledge. I definitely agree with Professor Dorita that it is very difficult for us, okay, to see the truth from all the perspectives. And as a result, it's very difficult for us to identify misinformation, disinformation sometimes. So for my empirical studies, I mostly focus on science misinformation, health misinformation that is judged by the current scientific knowledge. But of course, scientific truth is provisional, is open for updates and changes with new evidence. So what are the key findings from my past research? Well, first of all, we found that media use increases exposure to misinformation, especially among those who perceive a high level of fear of missing out. So some of you might think that only those who like to use social media a lot or alternative news media a lot for information expose themselves to a lot of misinformation. We found that actually almost all kinds of media use has a positive correlation with misinformation exposure, including traditional news media, social media, Gen AI. When we find that when people have a high level of need for information, also when they perceive a high level of fear of missing out, they don't want to miss anything. They will actually look for information from as many media channels as possible. But as a result, it also exposed them to more misinformation because of the current media landscape. Everyone has the pleasure of publishing quickly, okay, including the journalists, including the internet celebrities, or even the citizens who want some attention online. So as a result, people who proactively look for information will actually expose themselves to more misinformation online. So this is our media environment right now. And unfortunately, we humans are lazy animals, actually. Indeed, it's difficult to change people's current beliefs or attitudes or something. But when it comes to scientific claims, like claims about science findings or health messages, actually simply repeating a message to people can increase people's beliefs in that message. This is called the repetition effect in psychology. And our study has proved that as well. Digital media has facilitated the repetitive exposure to misinformation. For example, the algorithms of social media keep recommending you the posts that are popular or posts you might be interested in, right? No matter they are true or false. And also, if we obtain information from Gen AI chatbots, we need to know that the large language models has the problem of hallucination. So sometimes they provide misinformation. Also, the outputs of large language models are generated based on the current database. And the current data sets actually contains misinformation or outdated information that can be misleading as well. So so as a result, if we are repeatedly exposed to those misinformation, this could change people's beliefs. So recently, my co-authors and I have done an interesting experiment. We want to know that, okay, so Gen AI can provide misleading answers to people. What if we provide the source citations? You might have noticed that you can actually ask large language models to provide the references, okay, to their answers, right? So we want to know if that could help people to distinguish accurate and inaccurate information. Well, unfortunately, our finding was quite concerning. We found that without citations, participants rated accurate information as significantly more credible than inaccurate information. However, when citations are provided, participants rated accurate information and inaccurate information equally credible. Was worse when AI-generated content presented false information. Citing highly credible sources further increased perceived credibility. So our findings show that people seem not to be very interested in verifying information, even though when they verify or when they have the incentive to verify, they a lot of us have the ability to find the inaccurate information. But the reality is many people do not do so. Fortunately, professional corrections work. Okay, a lot of studies, including some of my studies, have proved that providing professional corrections can ease the effects of misinformation. Unfortunately, corrections are not as attractive as misinformation. Misinformation is produced to be sensational, that can arouse people's strong emotions, but corrections, okay, or scientific claims, okay, they are not sensational, not emotional, they are just calm, and sometimes if scientists are not very interested in publishing their findings to the public, okay, well, not many citizens will look for academic papers, okay, for their daily readings, right? And there are some ways to actually motivate people to verify information themselves. However, we should know that verification is not always helpful. For example, when correct information is not available, my study found that like during the early stage of COVID-19 pandemic, the more people verify, the more likely they expose themselves to misinformation. This is because correct information was just not available at that time. People could not find the correct information online. Also, we found there is a digital gap in news verification. People who have a high level of news or science literacy can find the accurate information as they verify more, but it's not the same for those who lack news or science literacy. Verification sometimes has backfire effect for those who do not have the news or science literacy. So, what are the takeaways here? Well, if we want to help the public to expose themselves to accurate information as well, besides the sensational misinformation, if we want to increase the proportion of accurate information in AI-generated answers, so we need to provide the accurate information to the public. They need to be available to everyone. So I think as scholars, we must speak up, and we must do so in ways that people actually want to hear. Because our research findings do not speak for themselves, they need to be communicated, amplified, and made compelling. So I think it's a great thing for scholars to actively produce public-facing content in their areas of expertise by accepting interviews, by doing science communication through social media, by doing podcasts, public lectures. And also the academic community should make an effort to help to increase people's science literacy, including how we generate the scientific knowledge, why sometimes you have conflict findings in the scientific knowledge, how should people interpret the scientific knowledge? And last but not least, okay, if we need to provide accurate information to the public, okay, we need to have enough media and AI literacy. We need to know how to transfer the scientific knowledge to the information that people want to hear. And also recently, you probably have seen from the news there are some scandals about scholars, misusing AI. For example, AI generates some fake references, okay, but the scholars might fail to find out and have the paper published, and that will lead to a decline in the trust in the science community. So we should be very careful about generated scientific knowledge ourselves, and think about communicating the scientific knowledge with the public. Well, it's easier said than done, because to be honest, it's definitely not easy to do so. So our team has been trying to publish our academic events, our academic findings on LinkedIn. As you see, we don't have many followers, okay? But we think it's meaningful to do so because, first of all, as I said before, we need to make the accurate information. We need to make the scientific knowledge available, okay, for the public first, okay? So that's the end of my sharing today, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Yu, for your work on misinformation and science communication. Glad to meet a fellow science comm researcher. And as someone who has reviewed and read papers with hallucinated reference lists, I appreciate your work. We've looked at myths of misinformation and alternate views of the nature of trust and knowledge, how people work with information and misinformation online, and maybe how misinformation or information in general might not even be the obligation, center, or cause. It's time for discussion. If I might start with the first question with permission of Dr. Choi, just to get the ball rolling. I want to direct this to the entire panel, and I will give my short answer first, but here's a question that was sent beforehand, just to get us started on discussion. How can university internal communication professionals position their roles at the intersection of science, policy, and teaching practice? Such professionals want to blend sustaining education-centered motivation while also bringing ethical reflection, critical thought, and strategic judgment to the table. What do we place on the front burner and what gets on the back burner? That is, what should be prioritized and what can take the backseat for now. My short answer is, as someone who does human-centered design and design thinking work, research the audience, gather insights from the many publics to see how people use information, what they need, what their concerns are, and how they define their problems. Dr. Yu, Dr. De Ridder, who would like to begin? Anyone may start.
Thank you for this question. Because I happen to be teaching in the master program of corporate communication, which focuses on internal communication as well. So I understand how challenging the work it can be by doing internal communication. I personally would position internal communication professionals not simply the messengers of the institutional decisions, but as the boundary spanners between the students' need, okay, the scholars' findings, the policy, and the practice. So I think internal communication professionals in university can help the organization ask some questions at the same time. For example, what does the evidence suggest? That evidence means refers to what students need, okay, and what scholars perceive as important in teaching in the university. And what does the policy require or enable us to do the education? And also, what does this mean for the teachers, learners in everyday practice? So I personally believe that at the front burner should be sense making. I think the internal communication professionals might need to figure out how the researchers and the students in the university perceive as educationally important, and to help us to connect the student learning and the professors' education. And then what should move to the back burner, I think, is probably something more promotional. But of course, I think although announcements or institutional branding still matter a lot, but I think the internal communication team should also be more on the strategic side. Okay, besides producing campaigns, I think the internal communication team can contribute to making strategic judgment by helping the leaders listen before they decide, help them to understand how scientific knowledge should be generated, and how we can better promote the scientific knowledge to the wider community to help maintain trust in the science community. So this is some of my personal thinking. Thank you.
So maybe if I can briefly add something, I'm always a little bit hesitant to give other people practical advice because I don't think philosophers have a great track record when it comes to giving practical advice. But having said that, I do think one sort of common theme throughout our three talks before was how important it is that science is and is also perceived and believed to be trustworthy. And I think in order to achieve that, the important thing is not for us to, state more facts or explain things again. It is much more important to build relations and to help people see how science actually works from the inside. And of course, that doesn't mean everyone needs to become a mini scientist, as it were. But I think it would be extremely helpful if people get a better sense of, and that includes students, but also the general public, a better sense of what science actually is, sort of to demystify science. And in a way, I mean, science is the long arm of common sense, as one of my fellow colleague philosophers once wrote. I mean, science is not that special compared to how people ordinarily form their beliefs. Sure, I mean, we have a lot more established knowledge that we build on, but in the end, what we do is just make observations and try to draw conclusions from those, which is what everyone does when they're trying to form their opinion, or at least when they try to do so in a careful way. So we can get people to understand that better, including the uncertainties, but also the certainties that science generates. I think that could be really helpful.
Thank you so much, Dr. Yu and Dr. De Ridder. Yes, I do agree. We demystify science, but also demystify what we think of the public and how we think they live their lives and use information. Thank you so much, both of you. We have a question on the chat from Mr. Robert Hollister. He says, many thanks for these excellent presentations, very instructive to those of us who are not specialists in scientific communication. What do the presenters recommend with respect to future priorities for teaching students in a broad range of disciplines? And if you could give successful examples, you may, either of you may begin.
So maybe this is preaching to the choir, but I mean, I personally do think that a bit of philosophy of science might be helpful here. Because it helps people understand how science works, what sort of assumptions it needs to make. it helps people think about the limits of scientific knowledge and also the possibilities of scientific knowledge. And of course, I mean, I've been teaching many of those courses, and I do know how hard it can be and how little of the actual content that I try to convey actually sticks. But this is what we can do as teachers, as researchers. So let's keep doing that.
Yeah, so one observation from my teaching, from my experience in classes, that I find that with the proliferation of AI, it seems that students nowadays, they are not so patient for the learning and thinking process in obtaining scientific knowledge. They just want to know the final truth, because it seems like that AI can give them the, like a very simple claims, okay, saying what you should know. They don't read books. They just ask AI, okay, what does this book tell me? They just want to jump to the final conclusion. But I always tell my students that when you are asked to read a book, it's not just about the final conclusion that you can get. It's the process itself. It's the learning processes that changes how you think and trains you to obtain knowledge in a scientific way. Science is not a warehouse of final answers. I think it is a method for testing claims, for us to revising conclusions in the past, and distinguishing stronger evidence from weaker evidence. So uncertainty is not a weakness of science. I think it is one of the best ethical strengths when we can communicate what is scientific knowledge honestly. So I think we should teach students to learn, okay, to judge who is making this claim. Okay, what evidence is offered to make this claim scientific? Is the claim consistent with the broader body of evidence, and what is the quality of this evidence, and what uncertainty remains, and how can I fix the uncertainty? This is the approach that I think is the most important in helping students to develop scientific thinking in the current media landscape. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Yu. I want to back up both of you on this. Yes to the philosophy of science, and yes to doing this, to having discussions on science as practice. I do have an example. I always start this way in my science and risk communication classes, and I look at all the assumptions that we make about knowledge, trust, scientific information. And the students don't like it. They don't like that they have to wrestle with philosophy. I mostly have senior students who already had 12 units of philosophy, 12 credit hours of philosophy going into senior year, and they are so brain tired. But they start understanding that the challenges of science communication and risk communication are not in where the facts are, but they're from larger, deeper, philosophically rooted issues like epistemology, uncertainty, and this perception of absolute science. Real quick, thank you so much for the idea of science as not being the final truth. I just, and something to add to the idea that students don't like that which is long and process oriented. That's true. One thing that has worked in my classes, I've made my students set aside all their electronics, write an essay on a science communication issue with a question given on the day itself, handwritten. So they have to set aside all electronics, write their essays. And even if they complain that I won't be able to read their handwriting, I always tell them, my handwriting is worse. I've seen worse. Let me read yours. They might start off reticent and resistant, but at the end of the semester, I've always seen students writing beautifully. They just need to be exposed to the beauty of that which is worked for and process oriented rather than fed and harvested in seconds. And we can't get that until we expose them and challenge them. We have another question here, and I believe it's for Dr. Yu. It's on the speed and repetition of online content. Do they really weaken people's ability to distinguish truth from familiarity?
I think a quick answer to this question um, um, is yes, because I guess some of you know the power of Gen AI. Actually, I think shortly after the ChatGPT 3.5 was published, okay, um, scholars and information researchers already found a lot of news websites completely generated by Gen AI. Okay, so yes, I will say um, the the speed of generating and repeating uh, content, including misinformation, nowadays is super fast. And if people are surrounded by misinformation, that people is in an information environment of low quality, it's actually quite difficult for themselves to proactively verify the information and has this spirit of looking for the truth. Because as I said, people in general are quite lazy. Okay, uh, even for myself, right? If it's a topic that is not super important to me, a topic that's not my research field, well, maybe I also don't have the motivation to dig into the truth behind. So I think we should be concerned about the problem of information environment, and also wonder if my previous study found that it became the worst when people do have a low level of freedom of speech. So when people are in an information environment that has a lot of misinformation, and when they don't really have a lot of access to opinions from different sides, okay, when the level of freedom of speech is low, but people feel desperate, and they keep looking for all kinds of misinformation, all kinds of information they can access from different channels, no matter how's the level of the source, how's the level of credibility of that source. So yeah, as someone mentioned, I saw someone mention the responsibility of the AI companies, and also I think the social media platforms do have a lot of responsibility in this. And as scientists ourselves, as scholars, I think our mission is to, okay, in this environment, how we can better make our voices loud to the public, okay, provide some more accurate scientific messages to the public. Of course, it's quite challenging. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Yu. I believe we have a participant who would like to ask, question, or clarify. Mr. Julian Skirm, you may go ahead.
Yeah, thanks everybody. Really good session. Really enjoyed listening to it all. I just and it's for anybody to answer actually on the panel. Like many universities, at the University of Manchester, we've been piloting a lot of work, and it's becoming an increasing trend in the way we're thinking about civic engagement and social responsibility, to have things like citizens juries and co-production events where we have academic knowledge being presented alongside community knowledge. So we think this, can genuinely counter kind of some of these post-truth dynamics, but perhaps as well, there's a slight nagging doubt we've got. They could risk legitimizing kind of epistemic relativism if we say that all forms of knowledge are equal, when we know that they're not from our presenters today. So how should universities navigate that tension in working with communities on things like vaccine hesitancy, or on the role of the rise of the far right, or on environmental skepticism, which we're really keen to engage in these topics with community members, but we definitely don't want to legitimize kind of the idea that all views are equally valid, as well. So yeah, any advice there from colleagues?
Let's start with Dr. De Ritter and then Dr. Yu.
Hmm. Yeah, it's a great question. It's also a very difficult one. Um, I and I don't think I have a ready answer for you, unfortunately. But I think one thing, well, okay, so one thing that I think that could help is, and this is a difficult path to navigate, but one thing that could help is to be clear and explicit about sort of the status of the evidence, the evidential quality for certain scientific knowledge claims, right? And so we certainly don't want to present this sort of false balance image, like, just because you know someone who, had a child that was vaccinated and then became sick, that suddenly disproves the massive amount of evidence. And this is hard to do because people's experiences are very real, and we all know that when it comes to presenting like big numbers against a personal narrative, a personal experience, the big numbers always lose, at least in the perception of the public. So I think the challenge is to do this in a compelling, in a friendly, perhaps even in a loving way that doesn't negate people's experience, but does make it clear that really it is just one or two experiences, and it goes against this massive amount of evidence that we have. So I guess what I'm sort of trying to illustrate is to be transparent and honest about the balance of evidence in these cases.
Thank you, Dr. De Ridder. Dr. Yu?
Thank you. Thank you for this great question. I think we can think about why scientific knowledge is being contested, or say why it seems that some scientific claims are being distrusted nowadays, right? I think one major reason is actually the politicization. When it comes to issues like vaccine, like climate change, like COVID-19, scientific claims often become attached to political identity in some areas, in some regions. And and once science is interpreted through partisan or ideological lenses, people may judge the evidence less by the quality of the science and more by whether it supports our side or their side. So I think that makes us scientists has a new mission in science communication. We need to find our way to communicate with the public with considering the cultural and political context behind. Because what makes a claim acceptable or not, besides the if it's methodologically acceptable, but also how it matches the local community's understanding about the politics and cultures. I think many scientists will say, I don't think that's my duty to learn that. If one is a doctor instead of a sociology. But I think if we want to do science communication better, we have to accept that. We have to try to understand why the public are against some scientific claims. I think it's quite important for our current society. And then I think another reason of maybe declining trust in scientific knowledge in some areas is that, as we mentioned before, there is uncertainty in science, right? And sometimes scientists need to give changing advice based on the new data. We have to make this clear to the public that right, we don't have the final truth, and we have to update our scientific knowledge if we have new data emerge. And then the third reason I think it nowadays is that it is because in the post-truth era, misinformation is everywhere. So people are more sensitive to the authenticity of information now, which I think in general is not a bad thing. So people have doubts. Okay, it's not against scientists. It's actually they hold doubts of all information they have access to. So it's not a bad thing. The more important thing is how to find the accurate
information, okay, and then decide, okay, if it's accurate or not. They should have the motivation and ability to verify information. And yeah, and finally, I think distrust in the scientific claims is also linked to the distrust in institutions. So I agree with Professor the reader that we should make scientific findings very transparent and try our best to stay neutral. Okay, in politics, in cultures, I think that might help people to have a more rational thinking about scientific knowledge. Okay, just some of my thinking. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Yu. Real quickly, I come from a Jesuit university and we work closely with many communities, many of them indigenous, with their own forms of knowledge. We do see science being contested, and this goes back to Brian Wen's article. People don't, it's not because science is untrustworthy, but because they think that the science that they believe in their heads is untrustworthy. The institution that feels far away and that gives multiple choice exams where all the knowledge always remains the same. So many communities feel that the information being given to them is so divorced from their reality. So what we do is we constantly work with communities. It's not just a single engagement. We bring scientists in. So the scientists as well learn from the communities and the communities learn from the scientists in constant conversation. It's not a single parachute in engagement. It's multiple engagements just to as well represent how science itself is always changing, even if the process remains the same. I hope that helped answer the question. Ms. Julian Skirp, thank you. Love the University of Manchester, was there once, want to go back. So we do, and I'm sorry we have actually reached the end, but we have time for a last question. And as usual, if it is the last question is always the pageant question, because in a sentence, and I direct this to our panel first, as I craft my sentence, in a sentence, how might you recommend integrating critical thinking into education, particularly in recognizing that we don't always see the world as it is or objectively? Anyone can begin.
So I'm tempted to say teach more philosophy, but maybe that's too easy. No, I think a crucial thing that's important here is teach students the process of thinking, not the products of thinking.
I think as educator, our job nowadays is to force the younger generation to think. I think that's our important duty, because I do observe that students nowadays rely too much on Gen AI, and they resist thinking because they think when they need something they can ask Gen AI. So they don't need to critically think about societal issues, think about how to draw to a scientific conclusion. So I think let's do more on that. Let's force them to do that in class. I don't know, maybe by discussion. I don't know if Professor Inez has any advice on how to force students to do that.
Incidentally, I do. Yes. But yeah, the part of it is make them write in class, really challenge them and move them out of their comfort zones, because they don't deserve to be put in a comfort zone when the world will always be volatile, uncertain, and chaotic. They need that training. And I love that challenge of make them think, make them give up on AI, or make them challenge and debate AI. We've done that in our classes. It works. Feed something into AI, fight with AI. And that's when the students laugh and love it, except that also kind of drains the water supply of a whole town just for the servers to be powered, for AI. But yeah, yes, I would piggyback on all of these ideas. I would say actually teach more philosophy. It works. And challenge students to think. I think that was pretty much that the entire discussion itself. We want to bring in deeper discussions and challenge our students and audiences to think through problems in an age where that which is quick is not always that which is efficient and can be trusted. Everyone, thank you so much for sitting, standing, questioning, and discussing with us through this entire 1 hour and coming into 7 minutes. I wish we had more time for questions and discussion, but thank you so much. This is Inez de Leon on behalf of the USRN. Thank you. Good day. Have a wonderful discussion and a great brainstorming wherever you are. And let's keep challenging our students. Goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye.